I know I certainly was absolutely shocked by how much those objects suddenly meant in a very different way, from when my parents were alive to suddenly they just were imbued with so much more the minute that they died.
Mary Frances O'Connor is one of my absolute favorite people in the grief space. Her books, The Grieving Brain and The Grieving Body, now both out in paperback, changed the way that I looked at grief, and I've recommended them to so many people. The way that she's able to talk in such a human way about the experience of grief and loss, as well as bringing her expertise in neuroscience to help us to understand what's happening to us, what's happening to our brains, what's happening to our bodies. I just love her work. So, we have a treat today on the Curating Grief Show. Well, welcome, Mary Frances O'Connor, to the Curating Grief Show. It's so lovely to have you here.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Charlene. I have looked forward to a longer conversation with you for quite a while.
That is so kind. So, so kind. And for people who don't know who you are, which I'm like, how do you know? How do you not know? Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. So, my claim to fame is probably that I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of Arizona. And I've been doing grief research for the past 25 years. So I got into this, too young. Um, but it has been such a passion of mine to really understand the why and how of grief. And the way that I think about doing that includes everything from, obviously interviewing people to taking neuroimaging scans of their brain while they're looking at a photo of the person who's died, or taking blood tests and looking at immune cell reactions. And all that has led me to feel like I deeply understand a lot of things about grief and grieving. But I guess I should also say that, I am a griever as well, like most of us. And so a lot of my knowledge is also informed from the death of my mom when I was 26 and the death of my dad about 10 years ago. And of course, all the smaller losses that we experience along the way.
Yeah, we often have that origin story, don't we? A lot of us doing this work of, well, there's the personal reason and the professional reason.
Yeah. And what's interesting though, Charlene, is, I finally realized it wasn't really so much about me trying to understand the how and why of my own grief, but in many ways, because my mother was sick for a very long
Mhm.
time, and um, we thought yeah, because of her being terminally ill for such a long time, a lot of the sort of questions I had were more about how could I have helped her with her grief.
Yeah.
And when I realized that, it made a lot more sense to me. It wasn't that my own grief was something that disrupted my work or prevented me from doing things I wanted to do, but it was this real, just empathic experience of her pain that made me feel we didn't have a good grasp on what grief is and how to sit with it. And I had thought that learning some more about how it works might help me to do that.
I'm always fascinated by how the circumstances of our losses, right, and the context in which we experience these losses shape our experiences of grief. And, right, I was 35 when my mother died,
Yeah.
and you've shared in your books and in your talks your experience of growing up with your mother who was sick for a long time. And what you shared there reminds me too of how you spoke about your role, right? And the people I've spoken to who have grown up with a parent who is sick or who lost a parent really young often kind of name this feeling of responsibility or the experience of being parentified. It
Yeah.
sounds like you're saying that like that also extended to how you approached your grief and grief in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah, I think it really, I think what was so interesting was, it's sort of appropriate at 26. You can have a really conflicted relationship with your mother at that
Oh
age,
yeah.
right? As you're sort of trying to step out into the world and to some degree away from your family. And that caused a lot of difficulty for her because I had played this role of sort of being her, yeah, source of regulation in many ways. And what's so interesting is that it it made me realize that when she died, I sort of thought all that feeling of responsibility, as you describe it, would go away, right? If she was gone, then I wouldn't feel all that sort of guilt or yeah, responsibility for the world. But of course, that didn't happen. I continued to feel all that same responsibility, even though it wasn't always for my mother or it wasn't with that, outlet. But I realized that that relationship, and this I think is what's so key, the relationship shaped who I was. And so I continued to respond to the world in sort of this caregiving responsibility kind of guilt kind of way. And I realized that it was a lot about understanding that relationship with her as it continued after she died that really mattered. Those continuing bonds, I think, are it's so helpful to understand that our brain has this internal representation of our loved one and this internal relationship, but that partly what that means is it can grow and transform across, the next 25 years of your life.
I've always found the way that you talk about, well, the neuroplasticity of the brain, right? And how our brains can adapt to be such a hopeful way of looking at this experience of loss, right? I love how you
Yeah.
describe it as your work being about really about the why and the how of grief, because certainly in my own experience and in my work with grieving people as a grief coach and with the people I speak with, the why can be such a difficult question. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I experiencing it this way? So I love that you take this approach to it too.
It is a lens that has made sense to me.
Yes.
It doesn't always mean it will make sense to everyone. And I don't necessarily think neuroscience is a better lens than other ways of thinking about it. But it is commonly a way we think about mental health, a way we think about psychology, about relationships now, mood, and so forth. So for me, understanding kind of what was happening inside the brain really helped me to come to an understanding that's pretty global. It's not super specific, but this idea that grieving really is a form of learning,
Yes.
that you really have to learn that your loved one is gone, and that there are reasons your brain is also maintaining the belief that they are everlasting as well, because that's how attachment neurobiology works. That when we bond with someone, right, whether that's our infant or our parent or our spouse, that inherent in that encoded bond in our brain is the idea that they'll always be there and you'll always be there for them. And the always part means that they don't have to be present for you to know that they're out there for you. I can go on a trip or you can send your kids off to school and it's okay because that bond endures even when they're not present. But the problem with that, of course, is when a loved one dies, they're not present. But that's not necessarily evidence for the brain that they're not coming back.
Yeah.
And so we continue to sort of interact with the world in many ways with this prediction error that they're there somewhere, that they're just not responding, or or they'll be back eventually, or all sorts of sort of magical thoughts that at some level we know aren't true, and on the other hand, we keep acting as though they are.
Yes. I've recommended your book, The Grieving Brain, to so many people. I personally self-identify as, one of the like the more instrumental grievers, someone who
Yeah,
wants to do things, do
yeah,
research. I like to think about it. I want to understand it. And I think that's the case with a lot of my clients as well.
yeah,
So having something to look at and say, oh, there are actual studies that say, of course we feel kind of crazy. Of
yeah,
course we have this surreal experience of saying, wait, but their shoes are still here. How is it they're not here? How is it that they're not coming back for these shoes?
yeah,
And saying like, oh, there's science behind this that helps to explain why we're experiencing this has,
yeah,
for me, been incredibly helpful.
yeah. It's I think, the why, knowing something of the why, it doesn't make you feel less of the grief. I wouldn't, for most people, for me, but it does make it feel okay to feel the grief, right? It does make it feel normal, like this is something that the brain does, and like you say, sort of the validation of seeing it in black and white or technicolor, the brain areas really are responding, um and so understanding the why, like I say, it's not the same as knowing what to do with your grief. It's not the same as not feeling grief. But I think the peace of mind that you're not crazy,
Yes.
or, even when you have these sort of what feel like crazy thoughts, that doesn't mean you're crazy. There's a reason, can be very comforting at a minimum.
And then you've also have your book, The Grieving Body, which introduces more research about really, it's evolving research, right? It's things that we're learning about how grief and loss affect the body.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, this is one of these situations where understanding that your heart rate really does go up, that your blood pressure really does go up, that your cortisol, those stress hormones really do increase. To know that that happens even in animals when they're separated from the one they're bonded to means it's not just you, that your body is having this reaction. And while we can learn over time, here's the learning again, while we can learn over time, this is the wave of grief. This is what it feels like in my body. This is, when it occurs and what I can do to sort of find comfort or outlet or at the moment. Nonetheless, I think understanding the intensity of that physical experience, that grief is a physical as well as an emotional experience, again, can be very validating for people and can help to explain behavior that seems kind of mysterious, like, I've lost 15% of my body weight, like, am I deadly sick? This turns out to be something that happens in grieving people, and for the most part, they gain that weight back, right? So just even knowing that this is a typical trajectory is very useful. Or I feel such rage, I want to kill the people who have not had the loss that I've had, to know that that thought is just your mind trying to explain the intensity of the adrenaline that you're feeling makes you realize, oh, okay, I'm not a bad person. I'm probably not going to become a murderer, right? It's just that my mind is trying to wrap words around this intense physical experience I'm having, can give us a chance to sort of pause and allow that to be true, but also allow that to move through us and not get stuck worrying about the grief we're feeling.
I find that it adds another layer of difficulty, right? We're
Yeah,
already experiencing this difficult loss, a major loss of a person, a place, a pet, an
yeah,
identity, and then to add on the layer of am I also dying? Or am
Yes.
I crazy? Is there something
Yes.
wrong with me? It just makes it so much harder.
It does. And especially because, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of what we might call grief literacy.
Mm,
And so the idea that people are not themselves,
yeah,
especially in acute grief, is something that society, often took for normal, that there were sort of really stereotyped but clear ways of interacting with people who were grieving. So, you know, people wearing black as a way to indicate that they were not themselves at the moment. And then, in the United States, this is one of my favorite sort of unusual examples. In the American Southeast, they will put a sign in a neighborhood, in the road, that says, "Please drive slowly. There is a bereaved person here." And I think, in our current world and culture, the idea that you would slow down your car because there's a grieving person in the neighborhood who needs a little bit of calm and peace, that's not typically how we react to bereaved people right now in
yeah,
our moment in history, in our culture. And so the idea that people are going to have grief reactions and how we respond to them as individuals, as a culture, as a neighborhood, as a family,
yeah,
um, can help to, in some ways, can help to make that feel more normal or can make people feel even more isolated. Um, but also that, the feelings of isolation are just also a part of feeling grief as well.
yeah. I mean, it's such a universal experience and such an individual experience.
Yeah,
I love that example of a community expressing
yeah,
care and
exactly.
saying, like, they're going to be more sensitive, they're more vulnerable, they're more
Yeah,
raw. How do we
yeah,
create conditions to express care for this person?
yes,
I find that when we talk about the belongings, right, in my work with grief and meaningful objects, that there are often a lot of parallels in terms of the lack of grief literacy.
yeah,
Just for grief in general, people, will say, "Are you still grieving? It's already been 2 years. Why are you crying? Why are you sad?" And that often translates to a widow getting friends
yeah,
and family saying, "It's been a year. Why haven't you cleaned out his closet?" Right? Why is your child's bedroom still like this?
yeah.
Do you see this as well?
I do. And what is so interesting to me is that the process itself of dealing with the belongings of a person who has lived and has used objects and has had important ties to us through those objects. It is a process to deal with those things. And I know I certainly was absolutely shocked by how much those objects suddenly meant in a very different way, from when my parents were alive to suddenly they just were imbued with so much more the minute that they died. And I remember, you know, my mom died, my ex-wife sort of really trying to help me and really trying to help me sort of clear things out, right? And I was absolutely stunned by just not being able to sort of take in the decision-making process. You know, as someone who sort of prides themselves on using their mind quite regularly,
We're so
I
logical.
we're so logical. And I remember thinking, I don't know. I don't know what I want to do with this. And that I had certainly heard people talk about it. I had seen evidence of it, as you say, where objects have been, sort of held onto. I just was bowled over by how much it affected me.
Yeah, I think that was my origin story, right? Being in my mother's house and staring at her bottle of soy sauce and thinking,
Yeah.
oh my God, if I can't throw this away,
Right.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Everything looked precious.
Yes. And then there's the other piece as well, which, for my sister and I, who I am so grateful to have had a sister going through this process. Fortunately, we came at it in a very similar way and had very little conflict, which obviously can cause a whole other set of grief earthquakes in a
Yes,
family.
indeed.
But given that we were quite simpatico and I think mostly felt very generous toward each other and the tender care was sort of paramount in our mind. But I think the process for us was felt unique because neither of us had children. And so each decision was also sort of a reminder that whatever we did with this object, it wasn't going further than us. And that, as you say, each relationship, each loss is in a context, right, around it. And that felt like a very different context than if we were. So we thought a lot about which one of us might need or want or care for something that was loved by our parents, but we were very aware that we didn't have to sort of hold it for the next generation. And that made it a unique experience, different from what others will feel.
Yeah. So you were just choosing for yourselves.
Yeah,
You weren't also playing the role of, oh, I have to be the archivist for the future
exactly.
generations. You
That's
didn't have to
it.
take that on that role too.
Exactly. Or know what would the next generation want, or in what way would they, need it preserved, or any of that. I mean, obviously we have we have cousins
Yeah.
and friends of the family and so forth. It wasn't that there was no one to consider, but not in the same way.
Yeah. It's not the same, I guess, sense of responsibility, like that word
Yeah,
again, right?
yeah.
It's interesting.
But
And
also not the same sense of legacy.
mm, like, was there a pang of
S-
grief about that too?
Absolutely, yes. And
Mm,
especially because it was both of us, I think. And although we had each decided we were childless by choice, those choices had been not the choices we had always thought we would make. And so there was definitely sort of confronting the fact that we were the last generation of this nuclear family. And that did bring its own um, emotional coloring to the process for us.
yes. I often think in these moments we're looking at not just the narrative for the life of the person who died, but also our own life narratives and our
Yeah,
family
exactly.
narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that like neuroscience or just the research in general says about why does this happen? Why does
Yeah.
everything potentially become precious after
Yeah.
there's a death or a loss?
Yeah. So it is interesting, the study of what we would call continuing bonds in psychology is a very active area of research right now. Um, Largely because there are different cultural ways of thinking about continuing bonds, and so in many ways we're even in the beginnings of sort of trying to define or describe what continuing bonds are. So part of this is that even in our Western culture, there was this idea, kind of originally with Freud, that you had to sort of remove the energy kind of from that relationship so that you could put that energy into relationships with other living loved ones. Freud himself, that was early work of his, and I think even he himself may have changed his perspective later in life, but more contemporary research realizes that this internal relationship that we have is actually a continuation, a continuing bond of a relationship we had with someone external. And so that internal mentalized relationship has to be transformed, has to go from something I'm doing kind of on the outside to something I'm only doing on the inside. And so continuing bonds are thought of as everything from having conversations. We did a daily diary study with young widows and widowers telling us about the interactions they had with their deceased loved one, which most of them did at one level or another. The woman who talked about as she would drive home from work, she felt like her husband was DJing what came on the radio because music had been really important to them when he was alive, and it was a moment of just really connecting with him in the day. Millions of different examples. So there's everything from that, which feels like a very personified sort of interaction to, when I look in the mirror, now that I'm in my 50s, I actually look like what my mom looked like when I was a kid, which of course at 26, I didn't, I had black hair. My mom had gray hair, right? Like I didn't look like my mom then. But now I look a lot like her. And so when I see myself in the mirror, I'm seeing her too. And so for me, it's not as much about having a conversation with her, but this sort of feeling of pride, carrying her values forward, knowing that she would want me to be doing whatever it is I'm getting ready to do that day. And so this internal relationship that we have, um, what's interesting is this idea that has also come up in psychology research about what we call a transitional object.
Mhm.
So now some people will know the word transitional object because we talk about it with children where, for example, they're going off to school or they're going, to play with a friend or something, and they will take that object with them, an object that they themselves have chosen, but that has some meaning and comfort with it and is associated with that meaning and comfort that they can carry with them, the external representation of it, to remind them. And this idea that because grief and loss is very much about this transition, the idea that many of those objects that that belonged or were used by our loved one suddenly develop this meaning, because they are a link, a tie to our representation of them. So where we're going from this sort of external person who, held this spoon or drank from this mug, and we have the object now, the idea is that ultimately we're able to sort of call on the comfort and memory and values, not just from the object, but internally from carrying that transited sort of value with us.
Yes, I've heard of transitional objects, eh, yes, mostly related to childhood
Yeah,
development.
yeah.
So are you saying that is this an element of like adult development or human development as well?
S- So I think it has to do with, we would call it an attachment behavior. So as a child is having to go from being physically present with a caregiver to having to be independent in the world, right? To have to be at kindergarten or to have to be at a friend's house. This transitional object seems like a behavior that sort of happens pretty naturally and quite commonly, to sort of ease this transition, right? To being able to function in the world without being in the physical presence of this caregiver, of this loved one.
So
And
that's our stuffed
so
animals, our blankies.
exactly.
Hmm.
Yes. And so the idea is not that this is a regression in adulthood, but that it may be similarly about transition from being in the presence of this person to being in the world without them physically present, but with carrying with them that internal awareness and comfort from them, much like a child learns to, bring mom along with internally, wherever, in kindergarten or wherever they are in the world.
So it's almost like sometimes we talk about supportive behaviors,
Yeah.
right? So if we're experiencing something hard, like losing
Yeah.
someone or something that's really important to us, and we're thrust into this new experience, this new scary experience,
Yeah.
that for some people, we might develop an attachment to something because it's
Yeah.
comforting to us and it feels supportive for that
Absolutely,
experience.
but I might, and this,
Hmm.
like I say, is a very active area of research. So I
Yeah.
don't think we have all the answers because there are people who think that these are useful. Some people, these, sort of transitional objects, some people think they're only useful for certain people. There's a lot of debate about how it works. I mostly think that for the most part, we're pretty resilient human beings, and so I think we're somewhere on a learning curve, usually most of us, and we're sort of doing the best we can, and it's probably going to work out okay. But I might make a slight distinction maybe in what you're saying from what I'm saying, just because
Mhm.
I've thought this
Yes.
is so helpful to be thinking about it out loud with you,
Oh, I love
because
geeking
you
out about this.
I know. Well, because you've thought about this stuff so much. So it isn't just that it's supportive, as in like, I look at this thing and it reminds me of them and it helps me. But rather we joke among the students, graduate students, we joke about having your emotional support water bottle with you. Like the idea that you sort of have this water bottle as a way to kind of regulate your emotions and joking about it.
Yeah, can't go anywhere without my lip balm.
Exactly, right? Emotional
Yeah.
support lip balm, right? So it isn't actually that we're only suggesting, I mean, that may be one of the functions of a transitional object, but I think it's more about the transitional part, like knowing that we're going from mom owned this, mom loved this thing. I have it now. It reminds me of mom. But I am taking it into the present moment where mom doesn't exist. I am transitioning to it is my object. It is my object that connects me to her, but it is different now in the present because she is gone. Do you see the difference? So as though it can be a real sort of reminder of what has changed
Mm.
because of the loss and that the thing that's important is it was good then, when mom owned and loved this thing, and it's good now that I love and own this thing even though mom is gone you know
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Like the distinguishing the way that I like to think about it is the different roles that the objects
yes,
play, right?
exactly.
Because for one person, it might
Yeah.
represent this. For someone else, it's
Yes.
serving this function.
Yeah.
And like I like using, that I have different categories. Like sometimes it's an
Yeah.
anchor, and then what
Yeah.
kind of anchor is it? And
Exactly.
sometimes it's evidence, right?
Yes,
Evidence they were
absolutely.
here, evidence that they're no longer here.
Exactly. And then it can be the transition itself. So I have a couple of objects if
Please
that's
share, please do.
yes. So the first one is was something of my dad's, and this feels like I don't know. I'm curious how you might categorize it, but it feels different than the other object I'll share. So, the first object that I'll share, I literally carry around every day. It's just here, right in my wallet, and it is this little pill case. So I'll see if you can see it here. So if you can read it, it's which you may
It's
or
a
may not be able to.
little
Yeah,
round yellow pill case.
little round case. Along the top here, it says Lilly, Eli Lilly, the pharmacy
Yeah.
company. And it's super handy. It's this little pill box, tiny, goes in my pocket or the front pocket of my tiny little bag. So my dad took a lot of medicine. My dad had a seizure disorder his whole life, and one time when he was with his neurologist, probably in like the 1960s, his neurologist had given him one of these. You know, it was like a handout, right? Because it's got Lily on it. And so it was like a handout from the company, like we still get in the doctor's office today, kind of thing. And my dad loved it. It was so handy. And the neurologist said, "Oh, if you like it, I have an entire box of them." So he gave him a huge box. Must have been hundreds of these. So my dad had this every day of his life. I saw this probably because he always had it with him.
Like in
And, you
his
know, over time,
pocket and
yeah, in his usually in
because
his
it,
pants pocket because it was so small.
yeah,
And when one would wear out, he had another because he had this huge, right? So literally for decades he was using them. And when he died, I came across the box of the
oh,
remaining
his
pill
supply.
boxes, his supply of them. And so now I have them, and I literally use them every single day. And it just, I very rarely even think of him now when I use it, which is almost better. It's just woven into my day-to-day life. But something about, you know, that we both, because I have multiple sclerosis, which runs in my dad's family along with the seizure disorder. And so there is sort of multiple layers, as you said, of connecting me to him, an activity that I saw him do every day, and an illness that I know he struggled with at times in the same way that I struggle with it at times. It's the fact that it's so ubiquitous and and that I don't even always think about him now, that it's just, I don't know, woven into my everyday life makes it really, really precious to me.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because of course my sister sees me using it. And she has memories of my dad using it. And she's like, "Oh my gosh, you're still using? That's amazing." You know, and I'm like, "Well, I have a dozen left, you know, so
May I share some of my reflections?
please.
So, like part of what I do with Curating Grief is during our monthly gathering for the grief gallery, we pretend
Yeah.
that we're in a gallery space and we invite people to bring an object or the story of an
Mm.
object to put on our display pedestal.
Mm.
And you get to share your story of it, why it's significant to you.
Yeah.
And then I'll offer to share my reflections of like, what do I see in
Yeah.
this, that relates to grief, but also in the relationship. And I love that you've shared this because it helps to illustrate to like such an everyday
Yeah.
giveaway, potentially throwaway item
Yeah.
that became so him,
Yeah.
right? It's often
Yep.
these little everyday items that just take
Yeah.
on special meaning because when you imagine the person, like, of course he
Yeah.
had that with him, always.
Always.
And like the story of not just the one, but he had a whole supply. And I can imagine too that it's, that maybe there was an evolution of your
Yeah.
relationship with this pillbox from
Yeah.
early, earlier on, closer to when he died
Yeah.
to now.
Mhm.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And yet, interestingly, much like my relationship with my father in his later life and my grief over his passing, it felt easy.
Mm.
So grief with my dad felt easy in the way that painful, um, but in the way that grief doesn't always feel easy. And so adopting this manner of his felt easy as well.
Yeah. And it's like the connections that we identify too, right? The
Yeah,
similarities in health conditions or
yeah,
in the way that we are with life or
yeah,
with the way we interact with things, I
yeah,
think is a way that we can, as you say, with continuing bonds, be an internal relationship.
yeah,
I think when I started, writing my book and was trying to understand more, like, well, I know curating like is a helpful lens. I
yeah,
know there's a reason that objects become so meaningful to us.
yeah.
And having that language of saying, oh, this is an external object that helps us to access the internal.
Yes, exactly.
And then in my work with people, I find that, and then we can also bring it out into the external,
Yeah,
right? So now this is an external object that continues to be in dialogue. with the
Yes.
internal.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's that's well said. It is, yeah, the external, the making visual, the making tactile,
yeah,
the internal relationship.
yeah. And how
Yeah.
you've integrated it into your life,
Yeah.
the way that we talk
Exactly.
about integrating grief and integrating
Yeah.
loss.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful
Yeah.
little round yellow
I
flat
know.
disc pillbox. Yeah, what else did you bring for us?
So I have one other, and unfortunately, I realized I don't have the physical object with me. I was going to show it to you on screen,
It's okay.
but
Many of us don't. Many of us don't have
yeah,
the belongings and don't have the
yeah,
physical objects. Sometimes we
yeah,
just have a photo, and
yeah,
sometimes we produce an object photo that just represents it. So
yeah,
if you're listening and you're
exactly.
thinking, I don't have anything,
Yeah,
you're not an archaeologist,
no,
you're not the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's okay
no,
if you don't have the actual object. We
absolutely.
can
And
still, yeah.
yes, well, we can still have that memory and that connection and the in this case, I have the object, but it is in the US and I am in London at the moment. So, but I will show you. So I'm gonna share my screen and show you a couple
Please.
of things. So these are my
So
parents.
this is a black and white photo of your parents.
Yes, Bill and Margot. And this is a photo from the late 1960s, their wedding day here, actually in England. And my mother's wearing this white wedding dress that is, you can't tell really easily in this photograph, but it is a very heavy lace. And when my mother died, I had already gotten married. I was actually getting divorced. Um, and or rather when I was cleaning out the house after my father died, I was getting divorced. Um and we had no reason to save the wedding dress. My mother was tiny. There was no way it would have fit either of us. Plus, we just didn't, there was no wedding on the horizon. But for whatever reason, I decided to save the wedding dress. It was nicely preserved. And so I kept it. Well, it turns out this year I did decide to get married to the man I've been with for about 10 years. And we were in England, and it seemed sort of this interesting and wonderful way to celebrate together. And so I took the dress to England and I took it to a tailor. And I asked the tailor if she could do something with the dress so that I could wear it. So this is Aida now, who's taken the dress apart and is making for me something I can wear. So I will show you then a photo of our wedding.
And that was a video
Uh,
of the seamstress
yes.
cutting
Cutting the
the
dress,
dress.
the heavy lace. And so this is a photo of our wedding. And you can sort of see in the photo, she's turned the dress into just a little like bolero jacket, which is something I wore over another dress then. And this is us leaving the place where we got married. But to be able to wear it in this very transformed way, to take it from a dress that was quite small and be able to open it up to something I could wear. I was so grateful to have her with me at the wedding.
That's so beautiful. The photo of your parents and your
Yeah.
mom
Mhm.
with her dark hair and the
Yeah.
veil to the transformation. Well, one interesting that you kept it even though you didn't know that you'd have
Yeah,
use for it potentially.
exactly.
Which, side note, I'm like, ooh, what do we tell people who are like, but I might need it someday?
I know. We never know. It's hard to pick.
That, like, your willingness to let it be transformed.
Mhm.
And that, like, again, when we talk about the role,
Yeah.
right? The role of an object to allow your
Yeah.
mother to be there
Yeah.
in this really unexpected but transformed way.
Yeah.
like really parallel to our
Yeah,
evolving continuing bonds, right?
exactly. I think this is what matters so much to me about this particular story. It's interesting. My sister saved her engagement ring. That was the thing my sister wanted. And fortunately, we didn't have a lot of animosity about which things each of us wanted to hold on to. And when my sister got married, she had the diamond reset into a totally different ring. It looks nothing like my mother's engagement ring. It's so perfectly my sister. But in both cases, this way of taking something good from our mom, out of all the things our mom gave us, which were good and bad and challenging and wonderful, to take the pieces that meant something to us and then transform them in a way that worked for our life now does feel, yeah, very much a metaphor for trying to take all the things, not just the physical things, forward in our life that are useful.
Yeah. You curated,
Yeah,
right? And you created something with
yeah,
it. Yeah, that's very much at the heart of the curating grief work,
yeah,
right? Because I think when you said the good things, not because there were challenging things too,
yeah,
you're speaking not just of physical items, right?
yeah,
You're speaking of relationship dynamics and
yeah,
memories. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I'm curious if when you were planning this wedding,
yeah,
if you had not kept the wedding dress,
yeah.
would you have had that pang of, oh no, I should have kept the dress?
It's so interesting, isn't it? I feel like I don't think I would have had that thought because I would have found a different way to incorporate her on the day. Um, it and this I think is the important thing to not confuse the object itself with what the object means to us. And so if something tragic had happened to the dress, for example, um or if it wasn't possible, that I took it to the tailor and they were like, "Oh, it's going to fall apart the minute we touch it," the wedding day would still have been incorporating elements of her in a different way. Nonetheless, the process of doing it was so lovely to share, to get to know the Taylors and to sort of get to share my mom's story. Uh, it would have happened differently, but it was a joy to have it happen the way it did as well.
Yes. I think that illustrates so beautifully, right? That when I talk about curating, there's an underlying question often of how do I want to remember,
Yes.
right? There's the whole thing that we inherit, whether it's
Yeah.
physical items or stories, and it's how do I remember the good things, the bad things, the challenging parts of it, a lot of conflict potentially for a lot of
Yep.
us.
Yep.
And then when we curate, we say, how do I want to remember?
Yeah.
And it sounds like, yeah, regardless of if you had the dress or not,
Yeah.
you trusted yourself to be okay, even if it
Yeah.
didn't work out.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, we might experience that grief, a little
Yeah.
pang of grief of saying, oh no, and then allowing that grief and saying like,
Yeah.
and I'll still be okay,
Yeah.
and I can still remember in the way that I want to remember, even if
Yeah.
I don't have that external item.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so, so much for your beautiful sharing. Any last
Mm.
thoughts that you want to end with?
Just, I think, it is surprising that things like the trust and the allowing the process to happen and um, it's it, there's a lot of ways in which people like you and I who want to understand grief and many grieving people um, understanding grief at a cognitive or a intellectual level is not the same as just living through it. And while I think, and I think you would agree, it can be helpful to understand it, we also have to live through it. It's a different kind of knowing. And I think we can embrace both.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Mary Frances, for helping us to both intellectualize, if that's helpful for us, but also to integrate as we need
Thank you.
to.
Yes, thank you, Charlene, for bringing this to people because it is it is wonderful to redirect us to these processes.
Thanks for joining the Curating Grief Show. If you would like some extra help, some practical and emotional support, go to curatinggrief.com. There you can find out more about my Sorting the Stuff of Life and Loss course, or any of a range of resources to help you use the lens of curating and to find a gentler, creative approach. That's curatinggrief.com. Take care.